In 2012, scientists 3D printed the spine of a medieval king, and when they tried to assemble the plastic vertebrae, they discovered something disturbing. The bones would only fit together one way. Like a jigsaw puzzle with a single solution, each twisted vertebra locked into the next at a precise, unnatural angle. The result was a corkscrew, a spiral of bone that should have been straight but instead wound through the torso like a staircase going nowhere. For 527 years, this man had been called a monster, a hunchback, a withered creature whose twisted body reflected his twisted soul. But when the scientists finished assembling those bones, they realised something that changed everything. Historians thought they knew about one of England's most hated kings. The propaganda was wrong. The skeleton told a completely different story. This is the true medical history of Richard III, the last English king to die in battle, the man Shakespeare turned into a cartoon villain, and the owner of one of the most famous spinal deformities in history. What makes this story remarkable isn't just the severity of his condition, it's what he managed to do despite it, and it's how his enemies used that condition to destroy his reputation for 5 centuries after his death. Because here's the thing about Richard III. He had a genuine, severe spinal deformity. That part is true, but almost everything else you've heard about it, that's fiction, invented by the people who killed him and took his crown. On August 22nd, 1485, Richard III rode into the Battle of Bosworth Field in full plate armour, wielding a battle axe, commanding the Royal Army of England. He was 32 years old. His spine curved 75 degrees to the right and twisted like a corkscrew from his shoulder blades to his mid-back. His right shoulder sat roughly 2 inches higher than his left. And none of that stopped him from fighting with what eyewitnesses described as manic energy, until the moment a halberd split open the back of his skull. The skeleton that archaeologists pulled from beneath a Leicester parking lot in 2012 bears the evidence of 11 wounds inflicted in those final minutes, 9 to the skull, 2 to the torso. But it also bears evidence of something else: old, healed fractures from previous battles. This wasn't a man who hid from combat. This was a warrior who had survived multiple military engagements despite a spinal deformity that, by modern standards, would qualify for immediate surgical intervention. So how did he do it? How did a medieval prince develop one of the most severe documented cases of scoliosis in royal history, and then become one of the most feared military commanders of his age? The answer lies in the bones themselves. September 2012, Leicester, England. Archaeologists are digging beneath a city council parking lot, a location that centuries earlier had been the site of Greyfriars Friary. They're looking for the remains of Richard III, the king who was hastily buried here after his defeat at Bosworth in 1485. They find a skeleton almost immediately. And when they carefully remove the bones from the ground, something is instantly, viscerally obvious. The spine is wrong. Dramatically, unmistakably wrong. Where there should be a straight column of vertebrae, there's a severe lateral curve that bends the entire torso to one side. But here's the problem. A skeleton buried for 527 years doesn't look the same as it did in life. The weight of soil, the process of decomposition, the shifting of earth over centuries, all of this can distort bones, flatten them, push them out of alignment. The archaeologists need to know, was this curve present during life? Or is it just damage from burial? The answer would come from the bones themselves, and to understand what happened next, you need to understand how scoliosis works. When a spine curves abnormally during the years when a person is still growing, it doesn't just bend, it reshapes the bones themselves. The vertebrae, which are still developing, grow asymmetrically. The small joints between each vertebra, called facet joints, develop at angles that match the curve. The spinous processes, those bony projections you can feel as bumps running down someone's back, twist to one side instead of pointing straight backward. In other words, if scoliosis is present during adolescence, the bones literally record the deformity in their structure. They become shaped by the curve, and once that happens, the bones can only fit together one way. This is exactly what the scientists found when they examined Richard III's vertebrae. The research team, led by experts from the University of Leicester, faced a challenge. How do you determine the true three-dimensional shape of a spine that's been flattened in a grave for half a millennium? Their solution was methodical and ingenious. First, they CT scanned every single vertebra. These scans generated detailed cross-sectional images of each bone structure, the asymmetries, the joint angles, the deformities, in 3 dimensions. Then they used those scans to create something remarkable: 3D printed polymer replicas of each vertebra, plastic copies, anatomically exact, of bones that had belonged to a medieval king. And then came the moment of truth. The researchers began assembling the plastic vertebrae one by one, allowing the geometry of each bone to dictate how the next bone must fit. Because of the asymmetric facet joints, those small joints that had developed during Richard's adolescence, there was often only one possible angle at which consecutive vertebrae could connect. Dr. Bruno Morgan, the forensic radiologist leading the imaging work, later explained the process. Some of the facet joints had degenerative remodeling where they fitted together like a jigsaw. The bones themselves told the scientists exactly how the spine had been shaped. There was no guesswork. The vertebrae could only assemble one way. When they finished, they had a complete 3-dimensional model of Richard III's spine as it had existed during his lifetime, and what they saw was extraordinary. The spine curved dramatically to the right, with the apex of the curve, the point of maximum deviation, located at the 8th and 9th thoracic vertebrae, roughly in the middle of the back. When viewed from the front, the spine formed an S shape, but that wasn't the distinctive feature. When viewed from above, the spine twisted, it spiraled, it corkscrewed through the torso in a helical pattern that pulled the ribcage asymmetrically, elevated the right shoulder, and compressed the entire trunk. Dr. Piers Mitchell of the University of Cambridge described it precisely. A scoliosis gives an extra twist to the spine, so that if you were to look from above, it would look like a corkscrew shape, and if you were to look from the front, it would look like an S shape. The Cobb angle, the standard measurement for scoliosis severity, calculated by measuring the angle between the uppermost and bottommost vertebrae in the curved region, was between 70 and 85 degrees. Most analyses cite approximately 75 degrees. To put that in perspective, modern medicine typically recommends surgery for curves exceeding 45 to 50 degrees. Richard's curve was roughly 50% more severe than the surgical threshold. By any standard, this was a serious spinal deformity. But here's where the story gets interesting. Richard III wasn't born with this condition. The skeletal evidence is clear. There are no congenital vertebral abnormalities, no malformed bones present from birth. Richard came into the world on October 2nd, 1452, as a normal, healthy infant. He spent his first decade as a normal, healthy child. The scoliosis developed later, during adolescence, most likely beginning around age 10 to 12, during his pubertal growth spurt. This pattern has a name in modern medicine: adolescent idiopathic scoliosis. Adolescent because it develops during the teenage years, idiopathic because the cause is unknown. No genetic syndrome explains it, no neuromuscular disease, no injury. The spine simply begins to curve during the critical growth phase, for reasons medicine still doesn't fully understand. Today, adolescent idiopathic scoliosis affects roughly 2 to 3% of adolescents, though most cases are mild. Severe curves like Richard's, 70 degrees or more, occur in a small fraction of those affected. Imagine being a medieval prince in the 1460s. Your older brother Edward has just seized the throne of England. You're part of the royal house of York, one of the most powerful families in Christendom. You're expected to lead armies, command respect, project strength, and your spine is slowly twisting into a corkscrew. The condition would have become noticeable gradually. First, perhaps a slight unevenness in the shoulders. Then, as the curve progressed during the growth spurt years, the asymmetry would have become more pronounced. The right shoulder rising, the torso shortening, the rib cage pulling to one side. Richard's military training would have been ongoing during these exact years. From childhood, sons of noble families received intensive instruction in horsemanship, weapons handling, and combat. Richard would have been learning to ride war horses, to wield swords and battle axes, to fight in armour, even as his spine was curving more severely with each passing month. The question is, what did his family do about it? Richard III, as a royal prince and eventually king, had access to the finest medical care available in 15th century England. His physicians would have been trained in the classical texts, Hippocrates, Galen, and the great Islamic physician Avicenna, whose work had been translated into Latin and formed the foundation of medieval European medicine. And medieval medicine did recognise scoliosis. More importantly, medieval medicine had treatments for it. The primary intervention was axial traction, essentially stretching the spine. Here's how it worked. The patient would be secured with ropes, typically fastened under the armpits and around the legs. Then, using wooden rollers or simple brute force, the physician would pull in opposite directions, attempting to stretch the vertebral column and hopefully reduce or halt the curvature. If that sounds familiar, it should. The procedure was mechanically identical to the medieval torture device known as the rack. The only difference was intent. Research by Dr. Mary Ann Lund of the University of Leicester examined records of Richard's medical household. Her findings confirm that Richard was, in her words, well placed to receive hands-on therapies for his scoliosis. Given that the condition likely became apparent during his adolescence, and that his family's physicians would have been trained in contemporary medical texts, it is probable, even likely, that Richard underwent some combination of traction and bracing during his teenage years. Medieval bracing involved fitting the patient with a rigid support, a long piece of wood or metal worn against the back, intended to prevent further curvature or, optimistically, to straighten the existing curve. These devices would have been cumbersome, uncomfortable, and restrictive. Picture it. A teenage prince, already self-conscious about his developing deformity, strapped into a wooden brace and periodically stretched on a device resembling a torture rack, all while trying to master the martial skills expected of a medieval nobleman. Here's what modern medicine knows that Richard's physicians didn't. Adolescent idiopathic scoliosis is driven by genetic factors that act primarily during the growth phase. No amount of stretching or bracing can change the underlying process. The treatments Richard likely endured, painful, restrictive, humiliating, would not have halted the progression of his curve during his adolescent years. But there's a crucial detail. Once the growth spurt ends, usually by age 18 to 20 in males, adolescent scoliosis typically stabilizes. The curve stops progressing because the spine has stopped growing. This means that by the time Richard was 20, his scoliosis had likely reached its maximum severity. The curve that the scientists measured in 2012, approximately 75 degrees, was probably the same curve Richard carried from his early 20s until his death at 32. And that brings us to the question that matters most. What could Richard actually do with a spine like that? The most remarkable aspect of Richard III's medical history isn't the severity of his condition, it's what the condition didn't prevent him from doing. Start with the basics. Richard did not limp. The research is unambiguous on this point. His leg bones, femur, tibia, fibula, are symmetric and well formed on both sides. The lateral curvature of his spine did not affect the mechanics of his gait, because his pelvis and legs were unaffected. Contemporary accounts from Richard's lifetime make no mention of him limping. Shakespeare's portrayal of a dragging, awkward gait is fiction. Richard did not have a withered arm. Thomas More's famous description of Richard pulling up his sleeve to reveal a withered arm, present from birth, has zero skeletal support. Both of Richard's arms are anatomically complete and symmetric. There's no evidence of atrophy, no evidence of neurological injury. The withered arm is another invention, propaganda designed to make Richard seem more monstrous. Richard had normal exercise tolerance. Curves of 70 to 85 degrees can sometimes compress the lungs, reducing breathing capacity and limiting physical activity. But modern biomechanical analysis of individuals with similar curves shows, in the words of the researchers, fairly good exercise tolerance and physical ability to do exercise and other activities. More importantly, Richard's skeleton shows no secondary changes that would suggest chronic respiratory compromise, no rib deformities, no signs of cardiac strain from oxygen deprivation. And then there's the evidence of combat. Richard III fought at the Battle of Bosworth Field in full plate armour, wielding a battle axe, leading cavalry charges. This is not speculation. It's documented by multiple eyewitness accounts and confirmed by the wounds on his skeleton. Medieval plate armour weighed 40 to 60 pounds. Wearing it required significant strength and endurance. Fighting in it, swinging weapons, absorbing blows, maintaining balance on horseback, required exceptional conditioning. Richard's skeleton shows evidence of old, healed fractures from previous battles. This wasn't his first combat experience. He had survived multiple military engagements, taking wounds and recovering before Bosworth. The image that emerges from the forensic evidence is not of a disabled man hiding from conflict. It's of a warrior who had adapted to his condition through years of training and determination. A man whose spine twisted like a corkscrew, but whose arms swung a battle axe with enough force to terrify his enemies. Here's the medical detail that explains how Richard achieved all of this. His scoliosis was well balanced. In scoliosis, balance refers to how the curve affects the overall alignment of the body. A poorly balanced curve might leave the head tilted to one side, the pelvis shifted, the entire body listing in one direction. This creates gait problems, balance issues, and visible asymmetry that's difficult to hide. Richard's curve was different. The spiral pattern of his scoliosis meant that the spine, after curving dramatically in the thoracic region, returned to relatively straight alignment by the time it reached the lower back and pelvis. His hips were level, his head and neck were essentially straight. The curvature, severe as it was contained primarily in the middle of his back. This had profound implications for both function and appearance. Functionally, it meant Richard could walk, run, ride, and fight without significant mechanical disadvantage. His legs worked normally, his balance was intact. His range of motion, while probably somewhat limited in the torso, was sufficient for combat. And in terms of appearance, it meant the deformity could be concealed. Medieval clothing of the late 15th century was not form-fitting. Noble garments were loose, heavily layered, and often padded in the shoulders, characteristics that would naturally obscure asymmetric shoulder heights. And then there was armour. A medieval king's battle armour was custom fabricated to his measurements. It was rigid, stylised, and designed to create an imposing silhouette. A skilled armourer could build plate armour that presented a perfectly symmetrical appearance regardless of the wearer's underlying bone structure. Think about what this means. Richard's subjects, seeing him in ceremonial armour or military dress, would have seen a symmetrical royal figure. The severe curve that existed beneath the metal might never have been apparent. Contemporary accounts from Richard's lifetime seem to confirm this. A near-contemporary description called him of person and bodily shape comely enough. A Cilician nobleman who met Richard in person described him as 3 fingers taller than myself but a bit slimmer and not as thick-set as I am. He has quite slender arms and thighs and also a great heart. No hunchback, no monster, just a slim man with a great heart. So where did the monster come from? The answer is politics. On August 22, 1485, Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field and seized the English throne. Henry's claim to the crown was shaky at best. He was descended from an illegitimate line, and his right to rule was primarily established by military victory, not bloodline. Henry needed to justify his usurpation. He needed the English people to believe that Richard had been a tyrant, a monster, a villain whose overthrow was not just legitimate, but righteous. And so the propaganda campaign began. Sir Thomas More wrote his History of King Richard III around 1513, roughly 28 years after Richard's death. More was 8 years old when Richard died. He never saw the king, never spoke to anyone who knew him well, and was writing under the patronage of Henry VIII, the son of the man who killed Richard. More's description of Richard became the foundation for centuries of slander, little of stature, ill-featured of limbs, crook-backed, his left shoulder much higher than his right, hard-favoured of visage, malicious, wrathful, envious from before birth. Note the errors. More claimed Richard's left shoulder was higher than his right. The skeleton proves the opposite, the right shoulder was elevated. More described Richard as crook-backed, implying a hunchback. The skeleton shows scoliosis, not kyphosis. More's account opened with an even more obvious error. He claimed that Edward IV, Richard's older brother, died at age 53. Edward was actually 40. This error is so blatant that some scholars believe More was being deliberately satirical, writing propaganda so obviously false that intelligent readers would recognise the joke. If so, the joke backfired spectacularly. In 1597, William Shakespeare wrote The Tragedy of Richard III, drawing heavily on More's account and other Tudor histories. Shakespeare created the image that would define Richard for the next 4 centuries, a poisonous bunch-backed toad. Shakespeare's Richard is a twisted villain whose deformed body reflects his deformed soul. He limps, his arm is withered. He plots murders and manipulates everyone around him. He is, in short, a cartoon monster. And Shakespeare was notoriously careless with facts. In his play, Richard kills the Duke of Somerset at the Battle of St Albans in 1455, when Richard was 2 years old. But Shakespeare's play was brilliant theatre, and brilliant theatre, performed for centuries, becomes cultural memory. The propaganda extended to visual imagery. Physical examination of surviving portraits of Richard III has revealed deliberate alterations. The most famous portrait, held in the royal collection, underwent X-ray analysis that exposed a remarkable deception. The original painting showed Richard with a straight, symmetric shoulder line. A later artist altered the portrait, raising the right shoulder and tilting the line to create the impression of deformity. The eye was also originally drawn differently, less slit-like, and was subsequently changed. These alterations were copied into reproductions of the portrait, spreading the false image through generations of artwork. In contrast, the portrait held by the Society of Antiquaries, which shows no significant alterations and was rendered with exceptional artistic skill, depicts Richard with a normal shoulder line. For 500 years, people looking at portraits of Richard III have been seeing a version doctored by his enemies. The skeleton beneath the Leicester parking lot waited 527 years to tell its story. When archaeologists finally recovered the remains in 2012, they needed to confirm the identification beyond any doubt. What followed was one of the oldest DNA identification cases on record. Mitochondrial DNA, genetic material passed down through the maternal line, was extracted from the bones and compared against 2 living descendants of Richard's sister, Anne of York. Michael Ibsen, representing the 19th generation of descent, showed a perfect whole genome mitochondrial DNA match with the skeleton. A second relative, Wendy Doldig, representing the 21st generation, matched at all positions except one, a single substitution easily explained by normal mutation rates over 21 generations. The combined Bayesian analysis yielded a likelihood ratio of 6.7 million. The posterior probability that these were Richard III's remains, 99.9994%. Alongside the genetic data, the skeleton matched everything that reliable contemporary sources described. Male, slim build, approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall, aged 30 to 34 years, severe scoliosis with the right shoulder higher than the left. After half a millennium, Richard III was identified, and then the skeleton revealed something the propagandists had tried to hide. The wounds tell the story of Richard's final minutes. 11 injuries, inflicted at or around the time of death, 9 to the skull, 2 to the torso. These are not old healed fractures from previous battles, these are fresh wounds, showing sharp cuts from bladed weapons. The bone has not begun to heal. These injuries were inflicted in Richard's final combat. The fatal blow came from behind. A large blade, probably a halberd or poleaxe, struck the back of Richard's skull with tremendous force. It sliced away a section of bone, exposing the brain. This wound would have been immediately fatal. Another blade penetrated the right side of the skull, entering and exiting through the brain. Some of the facial wounds, rectangular cuts through the cheekbone, a nick to the jaw, may have been inflicted after death. Humiliation injuries, desecration by Henry Tudor's victorious soldiers, mutilating the body of the fallen king. Contemporary accounts describe Richard's last moments at Bosworth with grudging respect, even from chroniclers writing under Tudor patronage. When the battle turned against him, Richard spotted Henry Tudor's position across the field. Rather than flee, rather than surrender, Richard led a cavalry charge directly at his rival. He fought his way through Henry's bodyguard. He killed Henry's standard-bearer with his own hands. He came within striking distance of Henry himself before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The man who died that day was not the withered cripple of Shakespeare's imagination. He was a king in full armour, fighting to the last, brought down only when surrounded by enemies and struck from behind. The skeleton that lay in Leicester for 5 centuries has finally corrected the historical record. Richard III did have a severe spinal deformity, adolescent idiopathic scoliosis with a 70 to 85 degree cob angle, manifesting as a right-sided thoracic curve with spiral rotation. His right shoulder was visibly higher than his left. His torso was shortened and asymmetric. These are facts confirmed by the bones themselves, but the skeleton also refutes centuries of propaganda. Richard was not a hunchback. Kyphosis, forward curvature of the spine, is completely absent from the skeletal evidence. His deformity was scoliosis, lateral bending combined with axial rotation. A person with scoliosis can maintain a straight head and neck because the curvature does not force the spine to bend forward. Richard did not have a withered arm. Both arms are anatomically complete and symmetric. Richard did not limp. His legs and pelvis were normal. Richard's deformity did not prevent him from being an active, effective military commander. The evidence of old battle wounds, the contemporary accounts of his martial prowess, and the manner of his death all confirm a man who not only participated in combat but excelled at it. The truth is almost worse than the lie. Richard III did have a genuine physical condition that set him apart. In an era when deformity was often interpreted as a sign of divine disfavour, his scoliosis would have been a source of gossip, perhaps suspicion, certainly comment, but the condition was manageable, concealable, compatible with a full life and a military career. What his enemies did after his death was take a real vulnerability and amplify it into a grotesque caricature. They transformed a man with an elevated shoulder into a hunchbacked monster. They invented a withered arm that never existed. They created a limping gait that the skeleton proves he never had. And then they made sure this false image would define him forever. The portraits were altered. The histories were written by the victors. The greatest playwright in the English language turned the propaganda into immortal art. From a contemporary medical standpoint, Richard III's scoliosis is both objectively severe and remarkably compatible with function. A 70 to 85 degree Cobb angle would qualify for surgical evaluation today. Modern fusion surgery, using pedicle screws and sophisticated instrumentation, can correct and stabilise curves like Richard's with excellent outcomes. A patient with Richard's condition born in the 21st century would likely undergo surgery in adolescence and grow up with a relatively straight spine. But Richard's example demonstrates something that modern medicine has increasingly recognised. Functional outcome is not determined by the severity of the curve alone. A person with a 75 degree curve that is well balanced, like Richard's, can have far better functional capacity than someone with a smaller curve that is poorly balanced. The geometry matters more than the magnitude. Today, notable individuals with adolescent idiopathic scoliosis include tennis champion James Blake and 8-time Olympic gold medal sprinter Usain Bolt. Both achieved elite athletic performance despite their spinal curves. Richard III, 500 years earlier, achieved something comparable in his own context: military excellence despite a severe spinal deformity. The skeleton beneath the parking lot waited more than 5 centuries to tell its story. What it revealed was not the monster of Shakespeare's play or Moore's propaganda. What it revealed was a man who overcame a severe physical condition through determination and adaptation. A warrior who rode into battle despite a spine that spiraled through his torso like a corkscrew. A king whose enemies hated him so much that killing him wasn't enough. They had to destroy his memory too. They almost succeeded. But bones don't lie. And the bones of Richard III, carefully excavated, painstakingly reconstructed, and exhaustively analysed, have finally spoken. The last Plantagenet king was not a hunchback. He was not a cripple. He was a man with severe scoliosis who refused to let it define him, until his enemies, 5 centuries after his death, finally got the chance to define him themselves. The men who killed Richard III thought they had won. Henry Tudor became Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, grandfather of Elizabeth I. But the bones have one more secret to tell. Because when scientists examined Richard's DNA, they found something that suggests the entire Tudor claim to legitimacy may have been built on a lie even bigger than the legend of the Hunchback King.